Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We are learning Mishna Yevamos, Parak Ches, chapter 8, Mishna Gimel, Mishna 3. Okay. Amayni umay avi, a Ammonite and a Moabite. Asurim, they are forbidden. They are forbidden to marry. They are forbidden to marry a Jewish, a Jew of proper lineage. The Surin Asur Olam, and their prohibition is eternal. There's never a point where the Ammoni, the Moavi, the Ammonite, the Moabite can become permitted. And the Torah says that. The Torah says even in the 10th generation, they cannot come into the congregation. Even to the 10th doesn't mean up to the 10th. It's just a way of saying that even as far, but it really means forever. But their females are forbidden right away. So that means if an Ammonite or a Moabite convert, if we're talking about a male converting, he is forbidden to come. He's forbidden to marry. Forbidden to marry into the congregation. Any children that he has further, right, have the status of any male child that is born from him also has that status. However, if we are talking about a female, the halacha is a female Moabite or Ammonite. If she converts, she's like any other convert who can marry into the congregation without any question. And any female descendant that is born. Meaning, if you have this Moabite man, right, and he has a girl, he gives birth, and he has a child who's a girl. So again, that girl, is going to be permitted, even if she carries the status of a Moabite and Ammonite, a female. It's not an issue. So therefore, we say, and that's the story of Rus, right? Rus was permitted to marry Boaz, right? Because the prohibition is only on the males and not on the females. Now, Mitzri Vadomi, we're talking about an ancient Egyptian or an Edomite, the descendants of Esav. The Torah tells us explicitly that they are forbidden to marry into the congregation up to the third generation. So that means an ancient Egyptian who converts, he cannot marry into the congregation. Who does he marry? He marries. He can theoretically marry. He can marry a convert. He can marry a convert. He can marry a mamzeres. The same thing before about the Ammonite and the Moabite. Although they cannot marry into the kahal, to the congregation, they can marry a convert. They can marry a mamzer. But the prohibition for the Egyptian and the Edomite are only up to the third generation. That means the first generation convert, his son, his child, those are going to be forbidden to marry. The third generation will be able to marry into the kahal, into the congregation. And here we say echad zacharim v'echad nekevos. Here, there's no distinction between male and female. They both are the same when it comes to the Egyptians and to the Moabites. They both cannot marry to the kahal until the third generation. Rabbi Shimon matir as an akevos miyad. Rabbi Shimon, he permits the females immediately. Meaning he says the same way the females of the Ammonites and the Moabites are immediately permitted, so the same thing applies to the females of the Egyptians and the Edomites. Now, Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said, now this is Rabbi Shimon making his argument as to why it should be so. Kal v'chomer hadvarim. We can use the process of kal v'chomer, which we translate as lenient and strict. We can use that process, kal v'chomer hadvarim. This matter can be settled through the power of a kal v'chomer. Now, just what exactly is the power of a kal v'chomer? So let me read to you from the notes. Kal v'chomer, literally lenient and strict, is one of the 13 methods through which laws are learned from Scripture. It means that when the Torah tells us a leniency in one area of law, we are surely allowed to apply it to another, more lenient area of law, or to apply a strict law in one area to another, stricter area of law. Rabbi Shimon will explain that we should take the leniency regarding females from Ammon and Moab and apply it to those from Egypt and Edom, since converts from Egypt and Edom are generally treated more leniently. So let's read now. Now that we understand the process, what is the kal v'chomer Rabbi Shimon? So he says like this: Uma im b'makom she'asar es hasacharim. we find in the place where the males are forbidden Isser Olam, they are forbidden forever. That is your more stricter situation. In your more stricter situation, what happens? What do we find in the Torah? Hitras and a kavas miyad. The Torah permitted the females immediately. So even in the more stricter situation, we find the leniency by the females. Therefore, in a place where the males are only forbidden, only until 3 generations, that's the Egyptians and the Edomites, should it not follow that we should permit the females right away. So it's very logical, right? Kal v'chomer. If in the more stricter situation, which is the Ammon and Moav, we say, and it's more strict there because by the males we see there is nowhere for them ever to marry into the kahal, to the congregation, we find that by the females her was lenient. So by the Egyptians and the Edomites, which is already more lenient even by the males, that means it's a more lenient type of law. All the more so, the leniency for females should apply. That's the argument. Amrulai. So they said, the sages said to Reb Shimon, Im halacha nekabel, if this is a halacha, meaning you have a tradition from your Rebbeim, you have a tradition, meaning basically a tradition that comes from Moshe, that this distinction exists, that even the female Edomites and Egyptians are permitted to marry immediately into the congregation, nekabel will accept it. V'im ledin, but if you're basing it on an argument, on a logic, meaning on the logic of the Kal v'chomer, yesh teshuva. There is a response to that. What's the response? So the Bartuner explains like this. The response is that by the Ammonites and the Moabites, the Torah gives the reason why the Torah does not want to allow them into the congregation. And that's because when the Jewish people were in the desert, they didn't go out and greet them with food and drink. So the Torah specifically gives a reason why the Ammonites and the Moabites are excluded. And that reason would not include females, because it's not the female's job or proper way to go out to offer food and drink. That's what the men should do. So even though by the men we find that it's more strict by Ammon and Moav, but being that the Torah gives a reason why Ammon and Moav is going to be forbidden, and that reason doesn't apply by women. Okay, so then that's why there's a leniency by women. Yes, by the men it's more strict. By the women it's lenient. The Torah gives a reason. The reason doesn't apply. The reason why they're forbidden. That reason doesn't apply by the females. So therefore, they weren't included in the prohibition. But by the Edomites and the Egyptians, there's nothing there about a reason as to why they cannot enter into the congregation. And therefore, with no distinction being made, there is no distinction. And the Kal v'chomer can't apply because the leniency of the females by Ammon and Moav is based on the reason the Torah gives. And therefore, that in itself is telling us that they should be lenient by the females. But where there is no reason given, there's no basis for distinction. Okay, so that was what the sage said back to Reb Shimon. Amar lahem, Reb Shimon said back to the sages, loiki, not so. Which means, number one, your argument against my Kal v'chomer isn't so. It's not a good argument. You know why? Because your argument is that the reason that the Torah gives is because they didn't go out to bring out food and drink, and that's not for the women to do. So Shimon argues and says, yes, it is. They shouldn't go to the men, but they can go to the women. They can go to the women. That's what they should have done. That means the reason should apply to the females, because they should have brought out the food and drink to the women. And nonetheless, you're telling me that there's still that leniency there. Therefore, it comes out that I can make the Kal v'chomer. The distinction that you made about the reason is a distinction, because the reason applies to the females too. They should have brought out to the women. The sages say back to them, and this is all brought down in the Gemara, the sages say back, nonetheless, it's not the way, even though the women could have gone out to the women, and from that aspect, it's still not the way for them to go out. They don't go out. They're not the ones who go out. And therefore, the distinction is there. So first, Reb Shimon said to them, loiki, not so. Your argument on your response to my Kal v'chomer isn't good. And halacha ani omer, I'm actually telling you it's a halacha. I do have a tradition from my Rebbeim that there is that the distinction applies to the females too. Halachically, we don't follow that. Even though the Gemara here says they would follow them, it's halacha. We at the end of the day, there is no distinction by the Egyptian Edomites between males and females. Next, Mamzer and asinim. Anyone who has the status of a mamzer and a sin. Mamzer, we understand, we've discussed this before, what makes a mamzer, and halachically, mamzer is a child that comes from one of the arayas, one of the forbidden relatives, who carries a punishment, any kind of death punishment. An asin, where the descendants of the Givonim, they were a group of Canaanites who tricked Yoshua into thinking that they were foreigners, and they converted. And eventually, the sages forbade them to marry into the Jewish people, and that prohibition was made similar to a mamzer. So Asurin, they are forbidden. The Yisurin Isur Eilam, their prohibition is forever. There's never a point of time they can become permitted. Again, by the mamzer, the Torah says the same thing as we said before. Even the 10th generation cannot enter, which is a way of saying they can never enter. Echad Zachar V'echad Nekeves, and applies both by males and by females. Now, again, who can a mamzer marry? He can marry a geras. He can actually marry a convert. He can marry another mamzeres. He can marry any other woman who is considered not a proper lineage. But at the end of the day, so he's allowed to marry them, no prohibition. But at the end of the day, his child is a mamzer. Still a mamzer. Okay.
There's two exceptions that we learned.
Okay.
I finished and then
Now, Kupamin, Shayach, is a Lashon Hara afilu al katan. And then it's even possible for the Rabbi of Lashon Hara to be on a minor. Going l'saper gnusa shel yasem katan shemegadol esay acher meseich beisam. For instance, to say something about an orphan that's being raised by other people. If people start saying bad things about them, then they may throw them out. So too, any kind of story that you tell that can cause damage or suffering or distress to the minor constitutes lashon hara. But let's say your intention of telling others is to protect them from any kind of damage that this child is doing, and to put them on the right path, mutter, it would be permissible. It has a constructive purpose. But you have to clarify without question that the story is true, not just to rely on what you hear from others. You have to figure out, you also have to be able to see what could be the consequences of what you're saying. And therefore, because sometimes, no matter what, sometimes even if the story is true, the consequences that come out are actually not done correctly. And therefore, if that's what Lashon Hara is going to cause, you may not say it. Have a wonderful day.
So there's two exceptions.
Stay clear of the snow, if you can find it.